Okay, I think we'll get started. Just a quick note, there is simultaneous interpretation to Arabic. You just have to click on more and go to interpretation. مرحبا جميعا، حيكون الويبينار باللغة الإنجليزية. يلي بحب يتابع باللغة العربية بس لازم يتابعنا عبر الزوم ويروح على يضغط على interpretation, English to Arabic. So hello, everyone. My name is Nadim Houri. I'm the Executive Director of the Arab Reform Initiative, and I'm very happy to be moderating today's webinar, which is our first episode in a new series called Siyasa Silicon. Our new webinar series really tries to move beyond narrow technical debates around technology and think about what ethics, accountability, and regional governance should mean in our relationship with technology. At the Arab Reform Initiative, we felt increasingly over the last few years, technology encroach across all our areas of work, from how knowledge is being produced, how knowledge is being disseminated, how it's being consumed, how public opinion is being manipulated and formed, and obviously, and most tragically over the last 2 years, how artificial intelligence, surveillance, and technology generally have really played a key role in Israel's war on Gaza, including in the conduct of the genocide. So we start this first episode by looking at AI-assisted operations, and to really discuss the role of algorithms. How can we limit this, including in the technology? What is the role of the law, and how can the law accompany this? And last but definitely not least, and perhaps for us sometimes most importantly, how do we understand the impact of this technology on those on the receiving end, in this case, Palestinians in Gaza, but be an ongoing in terms of victims of surveillance and in the West Bank, but also in Lebanon, and wondering what that means for the future of this technology. Really lucky to be joined by 3 fantastic speakers, and I really want to thank them for agreeing to join us, that I think bring very different insights, all fascinating in their own way. So Zena Asad, and a particular thank you to Zena because she's joining us from Australia where it's very, very late. Zena is a senior lecturer at the School of Engineering at the Australian National University, former fellow with the Australian Army Research Center and with the Trusted Autonomous Systems. And she's an engineer, she's a scientist, so she's been looking at how the safety of human-machine teaming, how they work, and the role of the machine and the role of humans. And in her recent writings, and actually a podcast that I would invite you all to check, maybe we can put the link in the chat, really Zena urges us to resist the myth that AI is deciding. Ultimately, it's human design that design the system, and humans interpret these results. So that gives us perhaps an entry point to think how we can regulate this. Our second speaker is Nihal Bhutta, holds the chair of public international law at the University of Edinburgh, an elected fellow of the Royal Society as well of Edinburgh. And before entering academia, he worked with Human Rights Watch and the International Center for Transitional Justice. And he's been involved in various efforts as a lawyer and as a scholar to think about the global governance architecture of AI. And now he's leading a research group at a newly established, I don't know how to pronounce it, Leverhulme Center for Algorithmic Life. Or I don't know, Nihal, you'd correct me. But basically, it's a new initiative really focused on decisions, which I think is very important for us. Basically, how algorithms are changing how high stakes decisions are being taken, particularly in the context of warfare, and what that means for our desire to pursue accountability when violations are committed. And within this context, he co-authored a report recently for the Global Commission on Responsible AI in the military domain. So really, I think Nihal will be bringing to us a sort of a legal/governance perspective and where discussions are in today's military. And Sophia, a good friend, who is the Harry Frank Guggenheim Research Fellow at University of Cambridge, Pembroke College. Also the author of an upcoming book that really looks at, sorry, Shreya, you'll have to remind me of the book in the title, but basically it's around the impact of algorithms and automated warfare in Israel and Palestine. And her research, and I really want to invite all of you to check it out. Again, maybe we can share some links. Looks at sort of ethnographic accounts of the impact of surveillance on Palestinians, particularly in the West Bank and in Hebron specifically. And I think her research in ways grounds us that this technology, its impact on lived realities of people, obviously Palestinians on the receiving end, but also on those who are making the decisions and how it can potentially blur ethics and sense of responsibility for soldiers who are deciding to do this. So now my task as the moderator today would really be to try to connect these three levels, the operational/technological with the legal and with the ethnographic, which centers the people, with really, I would say, 4 key questions that I would want us to explore. If we think that meaningful human control is what we want of this new technology, what do we really mean when we talk about our operational control over the data, the models, and the incentives of these algorithms and how they pick targets and so forth? The second dimension, and for us as a research institution very much grounded in the region of the Middle East, North Africa, what would it take for us, what coalitions of lawyers, researchers, universities, civil society groups, what would it take for us to have more transparency, more visibility, more auditing, so to speak, over the use of this technology, which is being used clearly on Palestinians, but possibly other groups in the region? And perhaps as well, and I think here Sophia's input will be very important, because I know as a think tank, we also engage with a lot of social scientists and political scientists. What is the role of the social sciences, of anthropology, ethnography, but also others, to really expose the harm of a technology that's often invisible? And what does that mean for us to be able to understand this in our ability to articulate the sort of rules, red lines, licensing conditions, and possibly remedies that we want to see happen? And we'll conclude a bit with a discussion of where do we go now after the use of AI in warfare in Gaza over the last 2 years. And just so that the discussion doesn't remain too concrete, too abstract, I wanted to just, I want us to start by acknowledging there's been quite a bit of reporting on Israel's use of AI in Gaza. There are names of technologies, things like Lavender, the Gospel, Where is Daddy, that have been mentioned. I'm not going to describe them in detail. Maybe they'll come out in the conversation. Most of them have been based on leaks through Israeli media and others. And basically, these are algorithms that are trained on massive surveillance data and massive data of Palestinians. And it assigns, for instance, scores to, this is Lavender, that assigns scores to people in Gaza that are suspected to be members of Hamas, of Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And I guess a certain threshold, probably set by humans, there's a targeting decision being made. We'll try to unpack a bit more at which points humans are involved and what do we know about these softwares. Or gospel, that at least what we know is that it's another tool that is used to assign and to attack not necessarily humans, but other physical targets. So it could be tunnels, it could be civilian infrastructure that somehow the algorithms decide this is most likely a considered under the algorithm rule, probably used in military. And whereas Daddy is a real surveillance tracking, where when someone, usually a suspected militant, according to how this technology is being presented, gets home or their cell phone or some surveillance triggers that they are home, their home is attacked. Again, this is what's been reported. We don't know yet exactly what technologies have been used in the context of Lebanon, but that's sort of the lay of the land. And I'm going to start with Zena to really help us unpack that interface between the technology and the humans. And Zena, you've argued in your writing, but also in conversations on your podcast, that AI, the algorithms in AI don't actually decide. It's the humans that do. They do so when they design it, when they test, when they select targets, and how they decide to use it and the error rate they're accepting of it. And that ultimately accountability should attach to the human involvement in their human role. I want you to break it down for us concretely. What would that look like? What would accountability look like after what we saw over the last 2 years? And when you say the humans still have control over the interface, concretely, do we know what that looks like? Is there sort of a person sitting in front of a screen and they get, they click yes or no on predetermined or I guess pre-selected targets by algorithms?
I think I'll start with first understanding how this idea of an algorithm has kind of changed over time. And the reason that's important is because the way that we talk about algorithms and the way that we understand them has shaped our expectations, not only of these technologies, but of the way that we interact with them. So originally an algorithm represented a mathematical construct, really, and now we use it to describe automated and AI-enabled tools. We use it when we talk about social media. We're always talking about the algorithm. We use it when we're talking about these particular technologies. And it's become this kind of elusive term that is used to describe decision-making, basically, on part of these complex systems. But realistically, what these systems are statistical-based systems. And when we talk about accountability in that context, accountability sits in two brackets. It sits in a technical bracket, and then it sits in a policy and a governance bracket. From a technical perspective, when we talk about accountability, what we're talking about is accountability across the system lifecycle. We're talking about decisions that were made at the point of design of these systems. How are we designing these systems? What technical requirements are we putting into these systems? We're talking about them from the point of development. Did we do the proper testing and evaluation and verification and validation for these systems? And then we get to the point of deployment. And this is really when a lot of those policy and governance kind of considerations come in. There is a false sort of narrative that accompanies this idea of an algorithm, of these systems kind of developing of a mind of their own and operating of their own accord. And it's not actually an accurate representation of how they're developed and how they're deployed. Realistically, they're developed across this life cycle, which has multiple intervention points. And when they're deployed in the context of broader command and control structures in the military. So when we talk about accountability in this particular context, we're talking about it really in those two brackets. We're talking about things from a broader technical perspective, and then we're talking about them from policy and governance perspectives. And it's the same with other legacy weapon systems that we've seen over time. So these AI-enabled tools or these automated tools really aren't the only examples of weapon systems that we've seen across history in which there are periods of time or portions of time in which we don't have human control or human decision-making. But for some reason, we talk about the quote unquote elusive algorithm in a way that we don't talk about these other systems. So unguided missiles is a really fantastic example, right? There is a significant portion of time in which there is no human decision making or human intervention, but we don't talk about that in the same way that we talk about these systems. So it's really important to understand how we got to this point of understanding these narratives around these elusive algorithms and how that's really warped our perceptions of this idea of accountability. But ultimately, yes, I do talk a lot in my work about accountability. It does always sit with humans. Humans are making decisions across that life cycle from a technical perspective. They're also making decisions at the point of deployment from both policy and governance perspectives on the way that these systems are implemented and the way that they're used. And then just on your final point, Nadim, around the interface, from my perspective, the interface is quite agnostic in terms of accountability. And what I mean by that is that we can implement more sophisticated and user-friendly interfaces, but the point of accountability still sits in those two brackets, really, of that technical accountability across a system lifecycle, and then the broader policy and governance considerations when it comes to accountability.
Thank you, Zainab. But I want to push it a bit further. So, I recognize we don't have full understanding and maybe about how this works, but at least from what's been available in the public realm, let's take, I don't know, lavender, perhaps the technology that's been most written about, at least in Israeli outlets. From what I understand, it basically assigns a score, if I understood it correctly in layperson, to people, statistical models of the likelihood of this person being a Hamas militant or an Islamic Jihad militant. I don't know what goes into that score. I mean, but things that have been leaked, it depends perhaps on who they're friends with on Facebook, certain patterns of behavior, perhaps age, gender, other things. I'm not sure if they appear on a database somewhere that the Israelis had access to. And somehow a computer gives a score to that person, if I'm understanding correctly. And then someone decides, as an Israeli general, that anyone who's got a score above a certain level is okay to be killed. Who checks? I mean, can you tell us a bit what we know about the technology? Do we know, is there any transparency about what is being fed into it? What is the data that is being fed into it? What is what criteria are being given any sort of scores? At which point do humans intervene in that? I mean, if I have two cousins that are members of Hamas, is that going to give me a high score? And that's game over for me. And I guess we'll talk about the role of military lawyers with Nihal in a second, but just technologically, that does seem to me a stretch further into the unknown than, you're right, the sort of automation tools that we've had before. But this is someone ascribing statistics to make a life and death decision about individuals. Can you tell us a bit more about the technology and where the humans interface with it, and how much of that underlying technology is available for us to analyze?
So I can answer this question just based on what is being reported. We really only have the information based on what is being reported. And there was a really good Washington Post article that came out at the end of last year that spoke quite a lot about lavender in particular. And what was interesting was that they spoke about the shift in the way these kinds of decisions were made with these kinds of systems, specifically the speed and the scale of these systems. So previously, it would have taken a significantly larger amount of time to filter through information before determining if a target was a member of Hamas, for example. But now with these systems, what they're able to do is at a far greater speed and scale, they're able to filter through data and information and make a statistical recommendation on whether or not a person is 30%, 40%, 50%, whatever the percentage is, likely a member of Hamas. As for where that information is coming from, we don't know entirely. We know that Google and Microsoft have both been involved in the development of these kinds of systems. We know that they have been involved in the collection and the collation of data, but what specific data goes into determining that final output, we don't know. And then as for the question of the decisions that get made after that, at the end of the day, this is it is just a technical system. And if this system does produce an output that says target X is 60% likely to be a member of Hamas, the decision on whether or not to then engage that target sits at a human level. And when I was talking before about the difference between technical considerations and policy and governance considerations, the decision on whether or not a 60% accuracy, for example, is an acceptable output or an acceptable accuracy, that's a policy and a governance decision. That is a human decision. And I think what these systems really have created for us is they've created a way of kind of shadowing and veiling some of the decisions that we make. And this goes down to that kind of elusive understanding of an algorithm. When we sit down and we try to decipher, you know, how this particular output came to be and where this decision came from and things like that, what we're doing really is that we're veiling the very much human decision making that is sitting behind these systems. So the specific data and information that has gone into them, we don't entirely know. But the decisions on how we use the information that comes out of those systems, those are still very much human decisions. And why those decisions are not producing what we would consider better or more strategic or more efficient or more effective outputs, those are very much human issues and human decisions that are being made. And it's really difficult to try to unpack those.
No, thank you very much. And I'll go in a second to Nihal, but I want to give you maybe one follow-up questions in on that. And on the, I would say, technological aspect, and I guess from an engineering governance perspective. So we'll talk about the laws and what the law would allow and what would be the governance framework in generally. But from even from a pure engineering perspective and from a science perspective, is the how much human control is on the process, in the sense what it says, once it says, you know, we've planned it that you should look at a person's relations, person's Facebook profile, patterns of behavior, you know, whatever. But what is the chain of command? I mean, I'm really thinking today when it comes to issues of accountability and what meaningful human control means in this setting. Is it even possible? I mean, I could totally imagine the person who made the decision saying, well, I just trusted that the algorithms is right, or that the underlying surveillance data is reliable. You can imagine there's so many steps in the process, from how the surveillance was taken to whichever score was assigned to the actual person who programmed it initially, to the person who inputted the data, to the actual person who made the decision of targeting, to the actual general or the policy person who set it at 70 or 80 or 60% or whatever. It's hard for me to imagine, purely technologically, not even talking about sort of the legal architecture of accountability, where does each person sign off? You know, I mean, is the discussion amongst the scientists that there should be a log that everyone who worked on this software, on this code, is actually listed when they logged in, what piece of the code they actually wrote, what they inputted? We're hearing now that AI can itself write code, right? So it's, I mean, I guess from an operational perspective, and I'm sorry if I'm not formulating it in the way that engineers would understand, but technologically speaking, do we know who did all of these things? You know, could we one day hope to kind of hold the creators, quote unquote, of a software, of an algorithm like Lavender accountable? You know, is there a register somewhere at the ministry or at Unit 8200 of the Israeli army? What is required from I guess, disclosure and from an operational perspective?
So software really is a scaffold of different pieces that come together to form a final product. There is no one single person who works on it. It's multiple people who work on it over time. And what differs with software versus other complex systems like a bridge or a car or a plane is that it's amorphous. It changes over time, it gets updated over time, and it's more malleable. So the idea that there is one engineer or one person responsible, unfortunately, isn't the case. It's not the case with most complex systems, and it's not the case with software. But as for holding creators accountable, I don't think it's a case that the creators are accountable in these particular circumstances. So what we're seeing with these kinds of systems that is a little bit different than other systems is that we're seeing much more of a bleeding between the civil and the military domain. And we're seeing a lot of these systems that were developed in civil contexts that are now being used in military contexts. And because of the way software is developed over time, there is no one single person who is involved from its initial inception and then will carry it through all the way. It's a little bit more malleable and it's a little bit more different. When we talk about accountability, even from a technical operational perspective, when the accountability does not sit with the creator or with a particular software engineer that worked on one particular update of one particular portion of that software, that level of technical accountability only comes into play if there is a malfunction in the system or an error in the system, or the system did not function in the way that it was intended to or advertised to. That's when we start going back into that kind of that timeline across a technical operational perspective to figure out where things go wrong. When we're looking at whether or not these systems were used in a conflict in a way that complies with international humanitarian law, that is a different accountability question. We would not go back and look at the creators of that technology to answer that accountability question. And so this goes back to the point I was making earlier, that there are two buckets. There's a technical accountability bucket and there is a policy and governance accountability bucket. So if there is an error or a malfunction in the system, or the system does not operate the way it is supposed to be operating, and there is something technically wrong with the system, yes, we would go back across the life cycle and find those points of failure across the life cycle. But you'll find that it won't sit with one creator, and that's just the nature of how software works. It won't. It'll be other failures across that system life cycle. But if we're talking about accountability specifically on the way that these systems were chosen to be used in a conflict and whether or not that complied with international humanitarian law, that is a different set of accountability questions. And we would not go back and look at the creators from a technical operational perspective when we're addressing those questions. So really they sit in two quite separate buckets.
No, I hear you. And I'm going to move to Nihal. But I take as well the point you made, and maybe we'll come back to it in the conversation as well, of the blending between, I mean, that's the problem. There's a lot of blending happening between the civilian and military. So let's assume, and we don't have the evidence yet, but it seems that some of these algorithms are looking at people's profiles on social media. If how many times I use the word martyr on my Facebook account and so forth, then and to assign me a score. What's sort of as well the responsibility of these social media companies and the database? So I think there's a lot to sort of unpack here, and which makes the pursuit of accountability even harder. So Nihal, you're a lawyer. You've been working a lot on governance, and we're in the realm with algorithms of statistical probability. But those of us who've worked on international humanitarian law, and for those of us who are not lawyers, I'm a recovering one. These are the what we call the laws of war, or IHL. There are two key principles. The first one is a principle of distinction. Basically, you can only attack combatants or people making meaningful contribution to the warfare effort. It's not a statistical score. And the other one is proportionality. You could argue that maybe when it comes to proportionality, the means used have to be proportional to the objective. But from what you've heard from Zeina, but also your reflections and your work in recent years and the current commissions you sit on, how are you thinking about accountability in this context? So if someone's family's been shot because targeting this, score was given through lavender of a percentage and someone pressed go, who do you think, how do you even approach thinking about accountability? How are these discussions taking place with lawyers who are advising militaries? And should we all be very, very scared because it's going to make accountability very hard to pursue?
Nadeem, I would preface my remarks also by noting that I think the origin story of the systems that the IDF has been using, in a way, has yet to be fully told. And we have some reporting, and actually, I look forward to hearing Sophia's thoughts about this because I know she's done some writing based on the fact that she's moved, but in some of these circles for some time with her fieldwork. But let me step back from the problem by putting it in a wider context. Accountability for unlawful killing in the context of war is extremely rare, right? Whether it's with or without this kind of system. So we need to start with that as our baseline. The laws exist. They are most of the time, even in militaries with fairly rigorous systems of military justice, they're very rarely prosecuted. And the extent of possible prosecution or even accountability of other kinds is often limited by the wider tactical or strategic context, right? So I think we'll have to start first from a very clear understanding that accountability for unlawful killing is a relatively rare phenomenon. However, you might say that at least in principle, in systems where we can trace the decision-making chain, we could identify where the error has been made. And I think that's what we see overwhelmingly in processes of review. So when the Americans bombed a hospital in Afghanistan, which was the MSF field hospital, it was possible to establish where they went wrong. I think everybody accepted that was not an intentional targeting. But it was, and it should have been on some kind of no strike list, but it's possible to reconstruct where the error lay. I think there's a couple of issues or a couple of dimensions of the development and advent of this technology which will make that much, much harder. It will also give, in practice, many more alibis, right, as you've suggested, for those who in some ways, from a factual point of view, are responsible for the decisions, but it's very, very difficult. It'll make it more difficult to hold them legally responsible, and I think almost impossible to hold them criminally responsible in most cases. And there's a couple of different reasons for this. One is, what is the tactical or strategic purpose of using this technology? And I just want to underline Zena's observation. It's really helpful, it's important we get our heads around the technology as it's being used, but also as it's evolving, and be careful with our terms and understand them properly. When we're speaking of these kinds of systems, what we're really talking about are inference machines. Inference machines which are drawing large numbers of complex inferences based on large amounts of data very quickly, in ways that humans probably wouldn't understand, or that can only be very incompletely reconstructed in terms of the actual inference. So, and the word that's thrown around occasionally is also that they function stochastically, which means we speak of statistics and probability, etc. But the defining feature here is that they don't function in the way of normal probabilistic inference, right? So all of these features together mean, first of all, it's very hard to understand the basis of the inference, even if it's right. Right? And the second problem, so that poses real challenges for an operator. To what extent could they ever really second guess the inference, the output that's being put to them? But it also creates a bit of a trade-off, right? Well, we don't really know how it works, but it seems to get a lot of things right, and it does so very fast. And if you're a military decision maker, if you're if you're somebody that's functioning at a strategic command level, well, there's arguments on both sides for using that machine. Right? But can you really afford to forego the speed of decision making, even if you accept that there is a kind of risk of error?
Well, do
Would it
we
be
even know?
unlawful?
Nihal, let me just interrupt you because
Yeah.
it's actually, I'm getting very scared right now.
Yeah.
Because for me, you're saying even the inference for those military operators, it's no longer clear to them. We might not even be able to comprehend. So let alone those of us who come from legal backgrounds who would maybe find it hard to understand. You're saying even those who designed it at some point, inferences are being tied, patterns are being found that maybe those of us mere mortals may not fully understand. So if I'm the one doing the targeting, I'm going to be less likely to second guess. The problem is, how do you even go back and say, if you're making a lot of decisions are being made in one day, and we're not talking in the abstract, we're talking, we just saw a genocide unfold in front of our eyes. At least it's comfortable, we've been using it, Ira, given all the legal expertise that we've seen on the topic. Where would you, I mean, where would you draw the line? Is anyone going to go and check the error rate, quote unquote, error rate of the system, whether how many people were actually legitimate targets? I mean, you know what I mean? This is as well. I'm not. How does the learning happen that whether this was a quote unquote successful target, this was a mistake, how many people died in the process? Are the militaries and the lawyers that advise them raising any red flags right now? Or is everyone saying yes because they're afraid of being left out and that some other army would use it and gain a benefit? So no one wants to sort of raise the red flags. Can you give us a sense of the sort of discussion? Because I don't see a role for the
So,
lawyers at this stage inside the armies.
so the first point I would make, so as I said, I gave you a little bit of a background, I think, in some of the dimensions of the technology, which I think are very worrying, right? And we should be taking seriously as a source of real risk. The question of whether those risks materialize is actually a question, I think, as Zena has pointed out, as to how you design and develop the technology and the way that you ring fence the kinds of decisions that it feeds into and how you validate those decisions. So there's multiple levels here, right? One is, first of all, when you're designing the technology, what are the risks that are inherent in the use to which you wish to put it, right? So some of this technology may not be used for targeting at all. So I'm familiar with some use cases where it's about moving tanks and trucks on the battlefield. That can take a lot of time to plan out. Can this bridge take the weight of an M1 tank or not? How do we know? That sort of stuff can take 3 or 4 days to figure out. If a system that's well designed with good data can figure it out in about 5 hours. That's a huge tactical advantage. It doesn't involve targeting anyone. So that you might say the risks of the kinds of things you're worried about are low. There are other risks, but inherent in the concept of operations, that's the problem is not targeting. But the closer you get to a place in, what people call the kill chain, it's not a term that I like, but in the fire chain, let's say, in the chain from identification through to weapons release, right? That's where all of these considerations come into play. So the first choice, and this is, I think, a really important observation, the first choice any military has to make is what are the boundaries we wish to put around the use of this technology in that decision-making process? How do we design our decision-making process relative to that? How do we design the technology in ways that maintain ultimately a form of human military judgment and try to reduce the risk of automation bias and other forms of acquiescence, right? So the bottom line here is it's not about knowing exactly how these inference machines reach to their conclusions. That sometimes you can design them for that, sometimes you can't, depending on the data and depending on the problem. But if you can't design them for that, or even if you could, you still have to engage in a fairly careful process by which, as a matter of law and policy, you as a state, as a developer, as an adopter, as a deployer, establish a framework for development and use that means that we can identify who a responsible decision maker was in relation to a particular function, that we can attribute a duty holder for particular kinds of decision making and provide a framework by which that person makes decisions that can be that allow human speed decision making to be the speed of particular choices, right? So that's the militaries want this because of scale and speed. They can do it faster and they can do it on a bigger scale than their enemy. That's the source of these risks, right? The faster you go, the higher scale, the more you're likely to end up with a system that's incomprehensible to you, but also that makes it very difficult to understand or retrace which was an error and which was not. And you start to accept a kind of all things considered, rough probability of error, which might be okay if you're talking about 10 or 15 or 20 strikes, but not if you're talking about thousands or tens of thousands, right? So all of this comes down to what you might think of as fundamentally law and policy choices about adoption, development, design, validation, deployment, training of people. And so my basic point about the law is we're going to get as much lawfulness as we commit ourselves to in these processes, where it's in this kind of situation, we're looking at the wrong end of the stick if we're emphasizing about the lawfulness of a given decision, red button, green button. That's, if you think about the nature of these systems, that's unlikely to yield of any kind of real traction, in my view. The lawfulness, or the question of lawfulness, has to extend backwards through the chain in ways that are about how have you adapted your organization and your tactics and your strategic choices. And I think if we think of it in those terms, actually this makes much more sense of the idea of decision making than the focus on the technology itself, right? If we take at their word what's been reported, right? What I would have observed from all of that is the unlawfulness of this rests in a very clear-cut human decision to lift restraints in a process, right? So yeah, I have lots of worries about the lawfulness of the surveillance, of the massive gathering of data, of the coercion that goes into this, but I think there's also real questions about the embedded policy decisions about who is a target and who is not. In my view, the IDF position is not consistent with international law. But all those things being what they are, there's no inevitability to the idea that you would start authorizing a target every 20 seconds, right? That's not required by the technology. That's a human decision, and that's a human decision that reflects a strategic choice. We are going to fight a war of annihilation. Once you make the choice to fight a war of annihilation, this technology is very helpful to you. If you're not fighting a war of annihilation, then the technology itself does not bring you to one.
Then, all right. So, but if you talk about this governance issues, and it's, what's interesting to me here is, and all three of you are really top experts in your field, we haven't seen, none of us fully understand what went into the decision making, for instance, in the case of Gaza, even less in the case of Lebanon, right? So if you're talking about that governance as you defined it, as sort of at the high level, at a macro level, in terms of the key decisions being made, are there any international efforts to regulate, address this? I mean, you're sitting, I think, on an important commission that's trying to articulate some new principles. Is the idea to adopt a new treaty? Would it be required that different armies explain how they're making these decisions? And more importantly, I guess from our perspective, the sort of armies and countries that are able to have and deploy this technology today is not everyone, right? I mean, this is you can imagine, I mean, if we go back in time and think about the US's global war on terror, which the image at the time was someone sitting, in Nebraska, far from the field, deploying a drone and making a life and death decision, right? I think this new algorithm takes it one step even further removed. The person making the killing at this point, it's not even the person pressing the button in Nevada or Nebraska It's the person higher up who may have decided anyone we think is potentially a member of the Taliban or a member of X group or Hamas, based on the algorithm saying there's a 70% chance they can be killed. How do you hold those people accountable? I mean, is it a new treaty? Are there efforts in that direction? Do the people and the countries on the sort of potential receiving end, and I know we're sort of entering into a new era, part of these conversations? Usually lawyers tend to write up these things. Do lawyers fully even understand the implications of the different decisions? Because again, here we're talking the principle of distinction. While you could say, well, people infer if they were a combatant or not, but there was this idea of, you look at the function they are doing. Here, it's, again, I mean, for me, at least, the sense that it's one step removed. So can you tell us where the debate is at internationally, and is the region partaking in this, our region, the MENA region, partaking in the conversation in any meaningful way?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And I think, so first and foremost, there is it's an ongoing process to try to think about a legally binding instrument in relation to something called autonomous weapon systems. That's not quite the same thing. So the kind of technologies we've been talking about are decision support systems, not autonomous weapon systems. And in that context, I think we might see some kind of a treaty that essentially rehearses and codifies a commitment to the application of international humanitarian law. But the bottom line is, and I think this is in some ways an unsatisfying response. The bottom line is development, adoption, deployment is going to happen at the national level. It's not going to be successfully and effectively regulated by a treaty at the international level, because you're not regulating the technology per se. Which you can't in many ways. You're regulating uses in a complex bureaucratic organization called military. And so, in a sense, what states have to do is to commit themselves to a certain approach of due diligence, to ensure and respect humanitarian law in the way in which they develop and deploy. Now, of course, that rests on, at some level, the idea that states can and will act, broadly with their legal commitments in mind and in good faith. And states don't do that. But there's very little way to regulate this through some sort of even if you were to get a treaty that says this is how you shall develop and adopt artificial intelligence in the military domain, you'd still fall back onto the machinery of the state to make that effective. So the problem of compliance you're never going to quite get around. I mean, the way that I think the only effective way for it to be tackled is often in alliances of states, where states essentially are incentivized to take such an approach, because if they're not, they can't effectively participate in the military alliance. So I think that would probably be true in the NATO context. So as I said, it's an unsatisfying answer, but I struggle to see any real way around it. But that said, that means that in the region, I think the emphasis has to be, and I think this is where the role for broadly civil society is understood, is that in order, if you want to constrain the problem of accountability, if you want to constrain the problems of misuse, then you need to be advocating for approaches that establish in some transparent way an approach which maintains commitments to lawfulness and to lawful use and to lawful application. How do you enforce those? That's going to depend very much on the national systems, right? In some cases, in the European context, it's not hard to imagine that some of these questions will appear before the European Court of Human Rights in the future. I don't think they'll appear now, but there will, in 10 or 15 years' time, one could imagine that's the case, just as mass surveillance ultimately was litigated before the European Court of Human Rights. So, from a practical point of view, what does it mean? It is actually about finding ways to press on military modernization processes, right, to embed a kind of global or multilateral approach to this. And I think that's what, so for example, the Global Commission on Responsible AI, that military AI that I was involved in, and Zena was involved in, ultimately, I think that's the upshot, that all states do have something of a mutual interest in establishing ground rules for development, adoption, and use, even if these are not in the treaty, whether it's in the form of a kind of model of adoption that is emulated by other states. A bit like the way human rights commissions became a sort of a bureaucratic model for human rights implementation in different states. So I think if you're trying to reform or shape a military bureaucratic approach to this, these kinds of effectively adoption and recommendation of adoption of approaches which other states have adopted and recommend and advocacy towards convergence can be one way forward. Just one thing to note is there is some push from the ICRC to demand that states refrain from using these systems to target humans. Now, right now, states are looking, leading states are looking at this with skepticism because they don't want to have any constraints on themselves. And there are some technical challenges as to what it might mean. But it's an example of how, an entity like ICRC is trying to draw some boundaries, set some limits on possible uses, which, again, is one of the ways in which we inch towards some forms of constraint here.
No, thanks, Nihal. And all right, so I think we've added a layer of, it seems to me that legal framework right now is still being developed. There's a lot of self-reliance. Again, that's not new in international law, but with very little disclosures right now, it seems, and little incentives and movement, perhaps with the exception of ICRC and others, to demand a sort of not you deploying this against humans until we figure things out. But I want to move to Sophia, because I think it's important to remember, and I have to say, Sophia, I discovered your work via Nihal, and I loved it. So I'm going to pitch it. Really, in your work on Hebron, you really traced how biometric and sort of surveillance systems and AI systems reshape daily life, from the checkpoints to digital blacklists to motion and heat sensors, license plate scanners, facial recognition algorithms, CCTV surveillance, how all of these tools of day-to-day occupation fed into, I'm going to throw another acronym, the Israeli Army's Blue Wolf program, which also there assigns you a security rating, which implies all sorts of things for your daily life. And I'm actually going to quote a couple of things from your writings. Say how Israeli military officials touted that system as part of an official move towards a frictionless occupation. That's a dystopian word if I ever heard of it, a frictionless occupation, which we can all imagine today that this is probably what they have in mind for Gaza tomorrow. And you mentioned, I think it's important for the social scientists there, that these, you wrote that these dystopian accounts conjured up images of Gilles Deleuze's control society. And to me, to a certain extent, I want, what I found really interesting is your methodology, your ethnography really described the impact of AI-powered surveillance technologies on actual people's lives, and how it eroded Palestinian social life, and creates a form of invisible violence that ultimately is actually all too real. But interestingly as well, I think in your research, you also seem to suggest and indicate how this use of technology insulates the Israeli army, and I guess the individuals in the Israeli army, from their responsibility in the violence, in the killing, and the occupation. It all becomes part of that cloud of algorithmic decisions. Can you tell us a bit more, kind of your ethnographic work, how you found the actual impact of the technology on people. Can you give us a bit of color about what that means to people living on the receiving end?
Sure, thank you. And thanks for the first two speakers for adding so much needed clarification to these topics, which can often get a bit complex. I will do that. I want to say first that as we're talking about the suite of AI-assisted decision support systems used in Gaza and throughout the last 2 years of war, just a kind of point of clarification. So as we've been discussing, these are AI-assisted decision support systems. I think that there's a tendency to kind of invest them with this kind of supernatural power and see them as automated killing machines that are seeking out and eradicating human life without any sort of human intervention. Lavender, where's Daddy, the Gospel, these are just a few in a larger suite of AI-assisted support systems that are guiding Israeli military operations. I think it's most useful for us when we're talking about how automation works in warfare, be it in Israel and Palestine or across the world, to kind of think about automation in terms of a stack. So you have systems like Lavender, these AI-assisted decision support systems that are helping to guide airstrikes and operations on the ground, but they themselves are predicated upon a host of other automated systems. So they might be predicated upon biometric surveillance systems that can categorize people's faces based on photographs. They might be using automated translation tools that can automatically translate intercepted telecommunications into the operator's native tongue. They might be using social media scraping algorithms to affix scores and other kinds of ratings to potential targets. So when I say that they operate as a stack, I mean that there's just layers of automation throughout the battlefield today, what Nihal described as the kill chain, and it really goes all the way down. So that kind of, those layers of automation, I think, make questions of human oversight and human control of these systems quite messy and quite sticky. And part of what I do as an anthropologist and a social scientist is to try to approach these questions through the level of the human and to look at how humans are interacting with these systems at various layers. So part of that work took me to places like Hebron in Jerusalem, where over the past decade, there's been a proliferation of surveillance systems. And those systems, be it cameras on city streets, facial recognition scanners at checkpoints, drones in the sky, all of those systems are taking data from Palestinian civilians living under Israeli military rule and using that data to train different kinds of AI-assisted military systems, be it the decision support systems that we're talking about or other kinds of surveillance and weapon systems. And so I think when we talk about these, and thanks Nadim for pointing this out, it's important to kind of think about what the effect of all of this is on individual people. So part of my research meant talking to civilians who are living in heavily surveilled cities and really understanding how the proliferation of all of these sensors, of cameras, of drones, really had a quite embodied and material effect on people's everyday lives. For example, if you go to a city like Hebron and you see cameras that are covering streets, often they'll be pointing directly into people's private homes. And this has a particularly gendered effect. You know, women would describe not wanting to take off their street clothes or hijabs when they were inside the privacy of their own homes because they were worried that cameras were pointing at them, taking their data. And I say that to really emphasize how this all kind of erodes people's last vestiges of autonomy and privacy. So that kind of embodied effect of surveillance, I would say, is kind of the base layer of these more complex surveillance systems that can lead to something as advanced as a recommendation system guiding an aerial strike. And I'm happy to kind of talk a bit more about that. But I think it's important to kind of ground our conversation in those quite quotidian and quite embodied experiences and remember that quite advanced AI-assisted weapon systems are really predicated upon intrusive forms of surveillance that have a quite disproportionate effect on civilians living in conflict zones. Yeah.
Can I follow up on that specifically? I mean, in your research, what were you able to infer what sort of data was being extracted from the surveillance? I mean, you've described to us very vividly a scene from Hebron, right? I'm assuming, you know, the Israeli army did not have the same level of on-the-ground control in Gaza over the last decade, but they maybe had control from, the skies, or perhaps control of social media. I mean, are you seeing how these sort of where the surveillance is, what aspects of life, you mentioned about the cameras in the bed, peering into rooms. Do we know what else is being used to build these databases? And any sense from your end? I mean, I'm fascinated by the issue of the profile of risk here. Is it based on if you're a young Palestinian man between a certain age, a beard with a certain number of friends, or went to certain schools or went to certain mosques? Is that the sort of data the surveillance is building these profiles? Like, were you ever able to see what determines someone's score?
So I'll say a few things. First is that the use of various kinds of surveillance systems, they're predicated upon vast amounts of different kinds of data taken from a variety of sources. And Israel, Israel is exceptional in some regards, but also many militaries around the world are building up similar kinds of surveillance and weapon systems using similar kinds of data. Israel, by virtue of having a decades-long military rule over the occupied Palestinian territories, has virtually unlimited access to many kinds of data taken from Palestinian civilians. So in the past few years, there's been more reporting on what exactly this entails. Israel controls the information and communication infrastructure across the West Bank and Gaza, which means that it can take and transcribe and store every single call and text message sent from the occupied Palestinian territories. So all of that data can inform different kinds of profiling systems that might inform targeting, like we've been talking about. Because there are checkpoints across the West Bank and also across the region, Israel can take photographs taken from Palestinians who are passing through those checkpoints, which includes biometric data taken from facial recognition cameras and eye scanners. Control of the airspace means that drones have free flying access and satellite imagery is widely available. So by virtue of being an occupying military power, Israel is uniquely positioned to amass and store a lot of quite sensitive data from civilians across the region. And all of that information informs various kinds of military surveillance systems, be it the recommendation systems that we've been talking about, Lavender, Where's Daddy, the Gospel, and a variety of other systems, and other kinds of automated weapon systems. So that's just kind of a snapshot of the kinds of data that we're talking about. And I should say, militaries like the United States have taken and stored civilians' data in places that they've been conducting counterinsurgency operations in, but the access is limited by virtue of just not having sustained a decades-long military rule over that area. So again, Palestine is quite unique in this regard. And many journalists and critics have called it a laboratory for the building and refining and deployment of automated weapons and surveillance systems for precisely that reason.
Actually, that's a good segue to the next question I want to ask you, which is this idea of Palestine as a testing ground for innovations in automated surveillance and warfare. And we've seen, and you've hinted at it in some of your work, that some of this technology is making its way where you end up, it's actually quite astounding the number of people who end up, start their career in the Israeli military, notably in the infamous unit 8,200, and then end up setting up startups, and then these startups end up being bought by big tech players, and so forth. And I'm wondering if, any reflections on your end about, and this is one of the questions that's coming up. So both on the role of the private technology startups and civilian tech conglomerates, and that we're seeing, and their role in this sort of new ecosystem. One of the questions, for instance, talks about how the data is actually stored on, servers, possibly of some big companies like Microsoft or Google, and how that's being mined. Do you see other examples of how Palestine could be used? One question, as we're sort of preparing for this webinar came up, what do we know about the use of this technology in the context of Lebanon. There's been less leaks about it. Does this mean that they're not using it, or they're using it differently? I'd love to kind of hear your thoughts on some of these issues.
Yeah, so the question from the Q&A and also what you're asking about kind of the global reach of these technologies is a good one. I would say that it's not quite kind of like a one-way flow from Israel into the world. I would say that actually as we've been talking about, the blurred lines between civilian and military technologies is incredibly blurred. And actually, it was civilian technology conglomerates maybe 20 years ago that were leading the way in developing some of the systems that militaries, including Israel, including the United States, were really eager to get their hands on, from mapping tools to biometric systems and the like. So oftentimes you'll have a civilian technology firm sell those systems directly to militaries as well. We've had reports come out in recent months about specifically the role of civilian AI giants and cloud computing providers have played have the role that they've played in supporting Israeli military operations. And I think that's an important one to kind of put a finger on. When we're talking about the massive scale of surveillance across Palestine, it's really a level of data collection that surpasses military's own ability to actually store all of that data. So the Israeli military reached out in recent years to civilian cloud providers so they could store surveillance data taken from the Palestinian territories on those cloud servers hosted elsewhere. And throughout the war, they were going back and forth between civilian cloud servers and their own military servers to coordinate operations, including operations in Gaza, and that kind of exchange, that kind of reliance on civilian computing infrastructure went against certain companies' own kinds of terms of use. So those kinds of entanglements, I think, have yielded a lot of pressure on civilian companies to really interrogate the terms of their contracts and really think about what do these partnerships actually entail, and what does implication look like in that context. And just a few weeks ago, Microsoft terminated a number of contracts with the IDF after more details about just exactly how their computing systems were being used. So it shows that you can have actual pressure, and you can have companies kind of interrogate what exactly is going on, and ensure that those kinds of exchanges are not continuing. So I think that's one kind of optimistic point to look at. But generally speaking, the trend towards militarization and an embrace of military contracting in Silicon Valley is not an optimistic one, and it's looking like both the war in Gaza and also the war in Ukraine has yielded a real resurgence in military contracting within civilian technology industries. And I think that throughout the war in Gaza, many technology companies, be it up-and-coming defense tech startups, as well as major companies, including Google, were providing different kinds of AI systems and weapon systems to the Israeli military, and really seizing upon the opportunity of a 2-year protracted warfare as really an opportunity to test and refine a variety of new systems. So I would encourage everybody to kind of dig into the reporting that's out there about what exactly that entails, because I think it shows really just how entangled the civilian AI industry is in war in Israel and also beyond.
Thank you very much, Sophia. So I want to go back. I mean, I think from the 3 interventions there, I'd love to hear from you, and there are a number of questions in the Q&A if you want to address them in the sort of next round. But I'd love to hear from you, and I'll go in sort of order: Zeina, Nihal, and Sophia. This issue of there are clearly accountability gaps, right? And you've painted a pretty complex picture. You know, you want to sort of what Nihal called the kill chain. It's not your term, Nihal, I know, but this idea of the multi-layered, what Zeina explained to us as sort of the complexity of how some of these algorithms are actually constructed, the different roles. Sophia, you added the layer of surveillance. And I mean, I think all through your 3 interventions, the role as well of the kind of, this is perhaps unlike even more than any other previous technology, the kind of enmeshing between the private sector and the military, that you simply need the servers of big companies to be able to to have that level of surveillance, which really brings us, I think, to the fundamental question of, if there's one reform, one effort, one guardrail, be it on the mass surveillance infrastructures, be it on having more transparency, be it on controlling things, what would you want that to be today? Where do you see the most promising effort to try to restrain some of this, or to control it, or to push for more transparency? I guess each of you, perhaps from your area of expertise or angle, are things that worry you. Zena?
So from my perspective, I'm obviously looking at this from a very technical perspective, but I do want to put the caveat of what I was talking about, in that there are the two different kind of buckets. We do have the technical bucket and the policy and the governance bucket. And a point I will make is that these systems do not come into deployment on their own. There are decisions that are made along that system life cycle to put these systems into deployment, and to put them into deployment in a state in which they are not as effective as they should be. Right? We're talking about things like we don't know what the accuracy levels are, but they're not very high. And so from my perspective, then, what I would want to see is specific regulations around technical requirements that these systems have to meet before they are allowed to be deployed. And we see that in other industries. For example, things like GPS. There are specific technical requirements around the accuracy and the integrity and the continuity of that information. And so that is what I would like to see. I would like to see very specific technical regulations and requirements of benchmarks that these systems would have to meet before they're put into deployment. Now, that will not address some of those policy, governance, and legal concerns, but what it will do is that it will add a layer of transparency around the actual capabilities of these systems. If we put in technical requirements and technical benchmarks, what it creates is a uniform benchmark of the expectations of these systems and what their actual limitations are. And I think that that will help a little bit with some of those transparency concerns, noting that it will not address some of the broader concerns that both Nihal and Sophia have brought up.
Thank you, Zena. Before I go to Nihal, I had one follow-up question for you. Is there a movement among scientists requiring some transparency in these algorithms? Let me just explain. I know from some of the literature on surveillance in the US around law enforcement, how there are systematic bias in the data against African Americans and so forth because of how the data has been trained, right? So who is perceived to be a threat? I mean, you can imagine, you transpose this in the context of the Middle East, quote unquote, where the data is going to point as to who are supposed to be the guilty ones with the beard. We've got two on the call as well, the bearded guys of a certain age, a certain behavior, if they go to the mall. I mean, there's inherent bias in the data that's been collected over decades and so forth. And the only way to try to kind of understand these inherent biases is to actually have to look at the sort of what's under the trunk to see what's going into these analysis and what are the factors and which factors are given which importance. Is there a movement among scientists say, watch out, there are inherent biases? It's not our fault. It's the data it's been trained on. The only way to kind of double check it is to have more transparency. Is there such a movement, sort of a open code for algorithms in warfare, or not at all?
I would say that there are a lot of researchers who point to the biases that come out of these systems because of the poorly curated data sets that they're trained on. But that's not a technical problem, that's a societal problem. So when we look at the way that data is collected and the way that it's curated, those are broader issues about the way that we choose to represent different demographics of people. So one of the things I talk about a lot in my work is it a technology problem, or is it just a problem that we're now seeing emulated in technology in a different way? And I would argue the biases that we see coming out of systems like these are a problem. They're an existing societal problem. We have biases in our society. We have biases in the way that we represent different demographics of people through the way that we collect data and the way that we curate data. What these kinds of systems did was that they highlighted and emulated those biases in a way that we hadn't seen before. So yes, there are a lot of researchers who are pointing to the biases of these systems, specifically in a military context. And yes, there are a lot of researchers who are calling for different interventions, both technical and non-technical, around how we could alleviate some of those biases. But I think it's important to highlight that they're not a technical problem, really. They're a broader societal problem that we're seeing coming through technology in a different way. And I think that is what is making people uncomfortable.
Thank you. So Nihal, over to you. I mean, what would you like to see happen in terms of governance aspects or kind of guardrails that you think would be important at this moment after what we've seen over the last 2 years, and I guess what we're sort of foreseeing and what's been building up for some time, that you think can deliver sort of some concrete guardrails or some measure of maybe slowing down as we try to figure out what is going on and how it's being deployed?
A difficult question in a way. I mean, I think one of the challenges is sometimes it seems utopian to be able to slow down the momentum to a dystopia, right? So I mean, I think what's been described in relation to Palestine is already highly dystopian. I think it rests on a set of historical preconditions that are not immediately or easily replicated elsewhere, both in terms of the nature of the underlying political economic project that Israel is trying to achieve, and also the depth and degree of domination that it's able to exercise with impunity, right? So, but if you can get those two things together, then as we can see, you're well on your way to establishing a reality that is thoroughly dystopian. So one instinct, of course, is to try to think of the ways in which we could avoid the replication of this dystopian reality in other contexts. And from that point of view, I think the wider situation is still pretty troubling. I think today or yesterday, the American bank JP Morgan announced a $10.5 trillion investment fund for national security and technology. And so if you've got, and we're currently at, spending $1 billion a day on AI generally, but there's billions of dollars of contracts currently up for grabs in the military domain for AI development. So the momentum behind the establishing some kind of proof of concept of these technologies is very, very high. One of the consequences of that is there's going to be more and more efforts to generate sort of technical fixes for the data problem and so on. But there's also going to be a fair amount of inflation of the claims for the technology, but also inflation of the morality and legality of the technology. So, for me, that any kind of response, we have to take this unfolding reality into account, right? So, there's a couple of avenues I think are quite promising, or at least not futile. One is, it seems to me there is some value in the contention that states should be strongly encouraged to take human targeting off the agenda for this. So it seems like a relatively small point, but it's, as you know, Nadim, from the world of human rights advocacy, one of the things that can be done successfully is to stigmatize particular usages, right? And I think human targeting and stigmatizing human targeting using this kind of technology might be quite a successful campaign. It creates friction. It forces states to adopt a policy position or to explain why they think it's okay, and can be the basis for certain amount of leverage, or at least some sort of ratcheting up of constraints over time. I mean, the question of private actors is very, very important. The possibility of holding private actors accountable for their supply chain, their contribution to supply chains, is better than it was before. If you look at the legal landscape in Europe, right, in places like France and Germany, some degree with the due diligence law at the EU, or that's now being revised, the possibility that by connecting your contribution to a supply chain directly to the commission of war crimes or crimes against humanity, you know, I don't think that's an avenue that should be explored. Holding private actors accountable for their role in the violation of human rights rules, international criminal law rules, that in turn could generate something of a chilling effect, right? But we have to take into account that it's in a context where there's literally trillions of dollars to be made. So it certainly won't be a magic bullet. I think the prospects for some sort of general treaty on this issue are very low. I also don't think it's necessarily going to be terribly effective. You could spend 15 years negotiating one, right, which is probably a conservative estimate of the time frame, and I'm not sure you'll achieve very much. So right now, I think it's a moment where we ought to be trying to sort of galvanize messages around the immense risks, the immense dehumanization that's involved. And here I think Israel's conduct in Palestine is very much a good example for those who wish to advocate such things. And also, you know, to be clear about the real challenges, not just to specific rules, actually, but actually to the rule of law as a whole, whether you think of it as a rule of law at the international level, at the level of constitutional law, at the level of human rights law. In my view, this not just the technology, but the technology embedded in this political economy and in a kind of societal dynamic in which, you know, the datification of everything is being strongly incentivized. Yeah, the challenges to the rule of law are absolutely huge.
Thanks, Nihal. And I think your talk about the context, I mean, Sophia, your thoughts, and as you think about thoughts of what you'd like to see, I mean, there's a question specifically to you about, you know, means of resistance to this data surveillance from sort of from your own research. Have you seen ways of people trying to overcome that? And your thoughts about what could act potentially as effective or not. And I'm actually, a question I wanted to ask you, sorry, I'm throwing that at you, but I'm fascinated. I mean, the sort of methodology you've applied, the sort of ethnographic evidence of your research, of the actual impact of these methods of warfare that are not very visible, how are they perceived in the sort of more policy and legal circles? You know, they just dismiss you. Oh, these are just anecdotes that Palestinian women no longer feel any sense of privacy in their own homes in Hebron, or you know, or is this something that you actually people are starting to listen to as they try to think about not just the legality of all of this, but the sort of ethics and where we're going?
Thank you. Yeah. So in terms of kind of accountability and the like, I would say I would echo what has been said already. I would also emphasize that many of these automated systems just don't work as well as they're advertised to. Automated translation tools, for example, that are incorporated into Israel's arsenal are known to be flawed, and there's been some excellent reporting about kind of lapses and errors embedded within them and how they don't work precisely as advertised, and they don't lend efficiency or expediency to military operations. The same can go for biometric systems that rely on facial recognition algorithms. These have high levels of error rates, and also the kinds of social scoring algorithms that are informing these recommendation systems. Those are highly controversial. And when police forces in places like the United States have used them, they've come under intense scrutiny and criticism from both lawyers and computer scientists about just how flawed these kinds of systems are. So taken as a whole, I think that's more of a case for really ensuring and asking that the use of automated decision support systems like that are particularly banned when it comes to pinpointing human targets on the battlefield, given the level of technical flaws and given the propensity for error embedded in those systems, and given the quite tangible cases we have now from Gaza and from other contexts where we have people relying on them to make life or death decisions about who should live and who should die in crowded civilian population centers. I think that's a particularly troublesome development, and I think that there is possibility for real movement to be made on banning banning military's reliance on those systems in that context. So I would say that, and I would also say in terms of just the use and utility of social scientific methods, of ethnographic methods, I would just emphasize that there is a need for more, be it research or reporting on the civilian harms of these technologies. And that can be done in quite simple and concrete ways by going to conflict zones, by talking to people who are living under increasingly automated surveillance and warfare, and really turning to these kinds of more quotidian, more embodied effects of automated weapon systems. There's a tendency both in reporting, in scholarship, and in the policy world to kind of reiterate this bird's eye view, which takes in the battlefield or takes in conflict zones from this kind of aerial view of a drone hovering above the sky. But we can really go onto the ground and talk about the many ways that these systems are affecting people right now. And that's not hard. And I would say that actually I've had the pleasure of having that kind of perspective really valued in policy circles, and especially with humanitarian organizations, and have had the pleasure of talking to many other journalists who are doing that kind of work, be it from Gaza or from the West Bank, or across the world in other kinds of conflict zones. So I would just say that there should be more of that happening, because instead of talking about automated warfare as this kind of future point, we can really ground our conversation and what's happening right now in various places around the world.
We have 2 minutes left, and really thank you for very rich. I haven't been very good at addressing some of the Q&As, but trying to integrate some of them. Maybe there was this, before I leave the floor with you, Sophia, just this issue. Did you see modes, interesting ways of resisting this, all observant surveillance from your own experience, new practices, how people are trying to, in a way, the sort of control society and efforts to elope it? Something that you want to leave us with that's maybe more on a hopeful note, or is resistance futile at this point, given the juggernaut and the trillions?
I appreciate the question. I never have a good answer to this one.
Okay. No, and I think that, I
yeah,
think it's
sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, please go ahead.
No. I just said I don't have a good answer to this question, so I would leave it for other speakers or audience members to offer their thoughts.
But maybe that could be a parting thought. If Zeina, Nihal, Sophia, if you want to, if there's a last image, last sentence you want to leave people who've been listening to us, and I'll start. I mean, for us at ARI, we want to widen the conversations, exactly like the one we've had today, with different disciplines, different perspectives, and perhaps give tools to our journalists in the region, to our researchers, to social scientists, not to be intimidated to engage on these essential issues. It will require, I think, for a lot of us to understand the technology. So thank you, Zeina, with your patience with my questions. I hope I didn't come across as completely ignorant on some of them, but really try to understand how these things work so that we can engage in a sort of common language, but also Nihal sort of on the legal insights, and Sophia on sort of grounding this and what that means to people on the ground. But I want to leave it to the three of you. If you feel like adding, a last thought, the last parting word in like 30 seconds before we close this webinar.
I think the only final thought I will leave with is just that technology is rarely the cause of problems, and it is more often than not people. And I think remembering that is really a good way for framing a lot of the issues that we're currently seeing.
Thank you, Zena. Nihal, any final words of wisdom?
Yeah, just to say, Nadeem, thanks for hosting this important conversation. And I think to underline the need that you've pointed to for, particularly in the region, for the careful strategizing and thinking, both in terms of vis-a-vis national militaries, as well as the sort of domestic institutions to grapple with these emerging risks.
And Sophia?
Thank you. Yeah, I would just say that it's quite valuable and important to be having also these conversations across disciplines and across sectors, bringing experts who have different kinds of knowledge of different aspects of technology, of human rights, of the ethics and impact of emerging weapons and surveillance systems is really, really important and does a lot to help demystify technologies that often take on this kind of grandiose meaning in journalistic reporting and in public debates. So thank you for bringing us together today.
Thank you all very much, and have a good rest of the day, and have a good evening, Zena. Bye-bye.